is the chair of the Federal Reserve, and he said that the economy is going to get worse, and it needs to get worse in order to bring down inflation. And it's the Federal Reserve's intention to make sure that that goes according to plan. The Federal Reserve holds an annual economic meeting at the Jackson Hole Resorts in Wyoming. This is their 45th annual meetup, and they get together to discuss important economic issues. A lot of important decisions and the direction of our economy are discussed at these meetings. At the 2021 meeting, so last year, Jerome Powell predicted that inflation would likely prove temporary, and then he reiterated his position, saying that inflation would be transitory. Therefore, the Federal Reserve and central banks, they took that to heart, what he said at the last Jackson Hole meeting, and they decided to do nothing about counteracting inflation, which, this is one of the primary reasons that inflation has gotten out of control. Now let's talk about this year's Jackson Hole meeting. Jerome Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, he gave the opening remarks today, which lasted for about 9 minutes. Powell said the goal is to bring inflation back down to 2%. He said without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. Powell mentioned that high inflation hurts the middle class, so middle class Americans, and low income Americans the most. Powell says in order to achieve price stability, the Federal Reserve will use their tools to forcefully bring demand down. The Federal Reserve, they only have two tools: increasing interest rates and lowering the supply of money. Powell says that the Federal Reserve will continue increasing interest rates. He says a consequence of this will be higher unemployment and pain for households and businesses. Powell said that these are unfortunate costs of reducing inflation, but it is necessary to lower inflation. So right now, the Federal Reserve, they have their interest rates set to 2.25% to 2.5%. Powell says that this is the interest rate that they want to be at in the long run. However, because inflation is elevated, the Federal Reserve, so this is what Jay Powell is saying. He's saying that the Federal Reserve needs to increase the interest rate in the short run to approximately 4% in the upcoming months ahead. Now, Powell is saying, he said this before and he said this again today. Powell said that they're going to make their decisions at the September meeting on how much to raise interest rates by based on the July and August inflation data. So when you want to measure the rate of inflation, you have the CPI and the PCE. CPI, that puts a higher emphasis on food, gasoline, and housing. Jerome Powell said the Federal Reserve prefers to measure inflation by analyzing PCE because it's a better indicator for the American people. In other words, the price of food, gas, and housing, it's less importance for Americans. I don't agree with that, but let's just play along with the government and entertain that idea. When measuring the rate of inflation with CPI, it was 9.1% in June, and then it fell to 8.5% in July. But you have to remember, the Federal Reserve is paying attention to PCE, not to CPI. The PCE report for the month of July was released this morning. PCE was at 6.8% in June, and it fell to 6.3% in July. Okay, just think about that. You're going from 6.8% to 6.3%. 6.3%, we are very far from 2%. And think about all the interest rate increases that we've already went through and the ramifications on the housing market, the stock market, the economy, etc. At this rate of inflation coming down, you're talking about 9 more months of the real estate market getting worse, the stock market coming down, the economy weakening if we continue at this pace. Unfortunately, how quickly inflation comes down will not be this fast, or it's not projected to be this fast in the coming months ahead. That's because inflation is expected to be stickier in the 4 to 5% range. So 9 months of suffering, that would be a good scenario. So let me tell you right now, I'm going to tell you again, we are in a recession and the economy is going to get worse. Jerome Powell, he is saying the same exact thing that I'm saying. He's just saying it in a different way. He says that we're going to see a softening in the labor markets and a sustained period of below trend growth. Again, he's saying the same thing that I'm saying. He's just saying it in a more delicate way. But he literally did say, word for word, there's going to be more pain to households and businesses. Listen, after the Jackson Hole meeting last year, Jerome Powell lost a lot of credibility by saying that inflation would be temporary, inflation would be transitory. Powell is trying to regain his credibility. He's trying to do that by raising interest rates and tightening the supply of money. However, Powell has not regained his credibility because he has still not explained why the Fed funds interest rate is at 2.5% when inflation is at 8.5%. that is a negative interest rate. That means you put money in the bank and you lose money at a very rapid pace. Powell says that he wants to get the interest rate up to 4%. However, again, inflation is at 8.5%. That's still a negative interest rate. He can't raise the interest rate sky high like they did 40 years ago, the Volcker style, to get inflation under control because of the excessive amount of US federal debt. Therefore, they're going to keep on doing these smaller incremental raises, which means that inflation, it's going to be stickier and it's going to linger around for longer than we'd like. So the bottom line is, what Jerome Powell said today, what he said this morning, it carried no good news. It was just confirmation of more bad things to come. The stock market misinterpreted the previous Federal Reserve meeting and we saw a dead cat bounce. And I'm doing another prediction. I think the stock markets are going to get, I think the stock market is going to get really ugly after the midterm elections once they don't start caring anymore.